The signal had been buried in 11 years of stellar noise, folded into the background radiation of a medium-class star like a message slipped inside a wall. Nobody was supposed to find it. Cale Morrow found it anyway, not because he was looking, because the people who needed it, found hidden, were running out of places to put the bodies. He'd been a frontier compliance operative for the Concorde for 6 years. Bird was the name humans used for the agreement between Earth and the Vreth Dominion that had ended the First Contact War in a manner more generous than the final casualty count suggested humanity had any right to expect. The Vreth had 17th warships in permanent geosynchronous orbit above the homeworld and called this a peacekeeping configuration. The Concorde had inspection rights over human research, communication networks, and cargo manifests above a certain cargo class. The Concorde had a human compliance division staffed by humans to handle enforcement cases that would be politically complicated if Vreth officers handled them directly. Cale Morrow was that division. Specifically, he was the part of it that went to retrieve things. He was good at it. He had a talent for stillness, for walking through checkpoints at the exact pace that read as unremarkable, looking directly at a monitoring system with the expression of a man who has nothing to hide, which was the expression of a man who had learned to separate his interior from his surface entirely. The Vreth biosensors read surface chemistry. They read cortisol gradients and pupil response and micro-accelerations of blood pressure. Morrow's biosignature, in a checkpoint line, read exactly the same, whether he was transporting a confiscated data packet or running an extraction he'd just decided 11 seconds ago to commit to. This talent was why they gave him the hard cases. Hard meaning politically sensitive. Hard meaning the thing being confiscated was something that, if a Vreth officer recovered it directly, would generate documentation that someone might eventually read. He was not given a lot of information about the things he collected. This was, he understood in retrospect, intentional. The briefing came through Liaison Commander Essa Voth, the Vreth attaché assigned to human compliance operations. She was tall, narrow, 4 optical receptors positioned in a horizontal arrangement that gave her a different kind of peripheral awareness than a human face. She watched him and the door and both corners of the room simultaneously, without moving her head. Her voice carried 2 frequencies, one just slightly out of phase with the other, which the translation system resolved into a flat, professional tone that nonetheless made the back of Morrow's teeth ache faintly if he listened too long. The briefing was simple. One Dr. Soren Albee, face, astrophysicist, formerly attached to the Helix Array Station on the outer reach of the Concorde-administered sector. Albee had been flagged for unauthorized removal of Dominion classified research materials. Morrow was to locate and intercept Albee before he reached Cressida Station, recover all materials, and return them to Dominion custody. What's the classification basis? Morrow had asked. It was the question he usually didn't ask. He'd asked it that day without planning to. Voth had looked at him with 2 of her 4 optical receptors. The research originated from observation data collected by Dominion instrumentation aboard the Helix Array. Under Article 12 of the Concorde Research Protocol, discoveries made using Dominion equipment are joint property of the Dominion and the researcher, Dominion retaining primary classification authority. I understand the protocol, Morrow said. I'm asking about the basis. The research involves stellar energy applications, Voth said, which fall under strategic classification. He'd accepted this. He hadn't asked more. He'd taken the data tablet, confirmed the target's last known position as Meridian Platform, and started moving. This was what he did. He was efficient because he didn't slow himself down with questions that weren't his to ask. He had believed, for 6 years, this was professional discipline. He was beginning to understand that it was something else. Meridian Platform was a transit hub on the outer ring of the sector, one of those sprawling structures that had begun as a refueling station in pre-Concorde era and had accreted over decades into a small city's worth of commerce, freight exchange, passenger transit, and the various auxiliary economies that grew wherever people had to wait. The main hub was 60 meters high, all carbon composite arches and recycled hull plating, with departure boards that scrolled in 9 languages including 2 Vreth dialects because the Platform was technically within the Concord Administrative Zone. Morrow found Albie in 40 minutes. He was sitting at a charging station near the lower concourse, a man in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific quality of stillness that Morrow recognized because he had it himself, but differently sourced. Morrow's stillness came from training. Albie's came from somewhere on the other side of fear. A man who had passed through the thing he was afraid of and found himself still moving. He had a single hard-case bag on his lap. He was eating a protein bar slowly and watching the departure boards, and he did not look up when Morrow sat down beside him. Just let the silence sit there for a moment. "You know who I am," Morrow said. "You're Morrow." Albie finished a bite. "You have a reputation for low-drama recoveries. You caught a man named Callus on this platform 2 years ago. He was carrying a soil analysis from the Reach Colony Network." He folded the wrapper at the corner, a fastidious small gesture. "Callus is still in Dominion custody. His family petitioned for contact rights 8 times. What Callus was carrying was classified." Albie looked at him for the first time. His eyes were pale, the color of old ice, clear and flat and patient. Callus was carrying proof that the Vreth Dominion has been seeding the agricultural substrate of the Reach colonies with metabolic inhibitors for 9 years. The inhibitors suppress the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that the colony soil programs depend on, not immediately, slowly. A degradation curve calculated to become critical in approximately 18 to 22 years, depending on colony size and crop rotation practices. He looked back at the departure board. In 20 years, the Reach colonies cannot feed themselves. They will require external supply chains. The Dominion controls the relevant supply infrastructure. Morrow said what he'd learned to say, in the version of himself he'd been until that morning. "That's above my clearance level, Doctor." "Yes," Albie said. "They've been careful about that." He reached into the bag and placed a small cylindrical data drive on the seat between them. Standard format, unmarked, the kind of thing you could carry in a pocket and lose in a crowd. He placed it with the deliberate gentleness of someone setting down something that will not be picked up again. "That's what Voth sent you for," he said. "Go ahead and read it. I have nowhere urgent to be." Something in the delivery made Morrow pause. Not anxiety, Albie had none. Not the falseness of someone setting a trap. The manner of a person who has arrived at a moment he prepared for and is watching it unfold without surprise. Morrow picked up the drive. He had a reader in his coat, calibrated to interface with standard format evidence containers. He slotted it and let it render. The data took 6 seconds to initialize, and then another 3 to display, and then Morrow sat with it. He'd expected policy data, or communications intercepts. The kind of thing the Vreth classified and unclassified, depending on what suited their current diplomatic posture. He'd recovered weapons schematics once, and corporate research twice. He'd carried things that he hadn't examined and returned them to Voth, and filed completion reports and moved on. What he was looking at was energy, not a metaphor, not geopolitical leverage reframed as energy, actual physical energy, a comprehensive methodology for extracting sustained power from the radiation profile of a medium-class star. 11 years of observation data from the Helix Array, cross-indexed with pre-Concord theoretical work from 3 human research institutions, synthesized into a replicable process that required no exotic materials, no Vreth-controlled supply chains, no infrastructure that humanity didn't already have the engineering capacity to build. A civilization with access to a medium-class star, which described, in practical terms, every inhabited system humanity had ever developed, could power itself indefinitely, at scale, without importing anything. The Vreth had classified it. They'd found the early stages of the research 4 years into Albie's work. Before the synthesis was complete, they'd assigned a Dominion research team to the Helix Array under the Article 12 Joint Development Protocol. They'd watched it develop. When it was finished, they'd labeled it Strategic Property of the Dominion, put it under the highest available classification tier, and buried it. They hadn't published it. They hadn't deployed it. They had done with it what you do with a thing that eliminates the dependency relationship your long-term strategy depends on. Morrow sat with the drive reader in his hand for a long time, long enough that Albie finished his protein bar and folded the wrapper into a small, precise square, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Colleagues, Albie said. Over the past 8 months. All listed as equipment failure incidents on the array station. Internal atmosphere breach for the first 2. Power cascade for the 3rd. He didn't look at Morrow. I have the maintenance logs. The equipment was not the problem. The charging station hummed. Around them the platform moved in its usual patterns. Freight workers and passengers and the occasional Vreth observer unit drifting through on routine monitoring passes, their matte gray chassis emitting the faint directional signal that human crowd management systems were calibrated to treat as a high priority. Pedestrian. Morrow looked at the drive. You said this is what Voth sent me for, he said. You gave it to me. Why? Albie reached into his coat and produced a second drive, smaller, with a strip of tape over the port. Because I have 6 copies with different encryption schemes, going to different contacts at Cressida Station. If I don't arrive in 8 hours, they transmit regardless. The drive you're holding is real. It's the original, but it's not the only version that exists. He placed the second drive back in his coat. I'm not asking for your help. I'm not asking you to let me go. Asking you to understand what you do and who you do it for. Morrow stood up. He walked away from Albie, toward the security gate on the concourse's north end. His credentials were in his coat pocket. The gate would scan him and pass him, and he would file a completion report, citing successful evidence recovery and partial subject non-compliance. The language for situations where the subject was aware of the operative's identity and fled before physical acquisition could be completed. He'd used that language before. He knew exactly how to write it, so it generated no follow-up. He walked 12 steps. He counted them without intending to. On the 13th, he stopped. It was not a dramatic moment from the outside. He was standing in a transit hub with his back to a man eating protein bars and his face toward a security gate. He was a man who had stopped walking. People stopped walking in transit hubs constantly for trivial reasons. Nobody looked at him. He stood there and he counted. Not for any reason he could have articulated. His mind was running its assessments, timing, risk calculation, the downstream consequences of deviation from a Concorde mission, the specifics of Vreth response protocols for compliance operative non-completion, and beneath all of that, something simpler was happening. He was looking at the folder, not a physical folder, the accumulated folder of 6 years, things he had collected and not examined, things he had carried and returned. The soil analysis from the Reach, which he hadn't read, the communications, intercepts from the colony networks, which he hadn't read, the research files he'd recovered from a xenobiology team 18 months ago, which Voth had sealed before he could run a summary index. He had been a good operative. He had been a good operative because he had built professional discipline around not looking at what he carried, the inhibitors in the Reach soil. 20 years until the colonies couldn't feed themselves. 3 people dead of equipment failure. The energy research classified and buried, while the Vreth fuel export system continued operating. Concorde administered pricing that human settlements had no leverage to negotiate. And Callus, somewhere in Dominion custody, tried to carry a piece of the truth and had been taken by someone exactly like Morrow. He stood at the gate. He counted 11 seconds. He didn't know why 11 specifically. Some things have a length and you feel it when it's complete. He turned around. Albie was still where he'd left him. He had not moved. He was not watching the gate. He was watching the departure board. And his expression was the expression of someone who has prepared themselves for whatever comes next, and is simply waiting to find out which version of it arrives. He looked up when Morrow returned. Morrow sat back down. Where's the broadcast point at Cressida? Albie told him. And then he was quiet, in the manner of someone who understood that this was not the moment for explanation or gratitude, but for movement. I have credentials that will pass us through 6 of the 8 checkpoints on the platform, Morrow said. 2 automated Vreth systems are going to be the problem. My deviation from mission parameters will flag within. He checked his internal timer, approximately 4 hours. After that, Voth initiates protocol, and the automated systems get a live update. I need us clear of this platform before that happens. He looked at Albie. Can you walk without looking like you're trying to walk in a specific... I've been waiting on this platform for 3 days, Albie said. I can look like anything. What followed was the practical reality of decisions made in transit hubs. Not clean, not cinematic in the way that memory later compresses it into. Morrow moved through the Meridian platform with Albie behind him and his credentials in his coat pocket, using them at each checkpoint in sequence, the practiced motions of a man running a routine evidence transport. He set his pace carefully. Not hurried, not leisurely, the specific neutral velocity of someone with a schedule. He had learned this pace over years, and it served him now for a reason he would not have predicted when he learned it. Checkpoint. An automated VRETH unit, flat lens, the soft white glow of its scanning array. The system queried his biometrics twice in sequence instead of once. A delay protocol meant for remote review authorization. Morrow stood with his face still, and his hands at his sides and his pulse at a number he chose and held it there, while the system ran its check. 15 seconds. The gate cleared. He had long since understood that the VRETH biosensor systems were sophisticated and reliable and systematically designed to identify the physiological indicators of deception in species whose evolution had not emphasized the separation of interior from exterior. Humans had evolved in societies that required, for survival, for politics, 10,000 negotiations that made up a life, the ability to present one thing and carry another. It was not unique to humans. But the VRETH had underestimated the degree of the adaptation. Their sensors caught cortisol. They caught pupil response. They could not catch the decision to be calm that a trained human body implemented so far below the threshold of active will that it didn't produce the indicators they were measuring. Morrow was afraid. He was running an unsanctioned deviation from a Concorde mission with the primary target, walking behind him through a facility staffed by VRETH monitoring systems. He was afraid, in the specific way of someone who has committed to a thing that cannot be uncommitted to, which is different from anticipatory fear. It has no indecision in it. An indecision is most of what the body expresses when it's afraid of the thing. They reached the lower transit corridor, the part of Meridian platform that predated the Concorde, built in the early colony era before anyone was designing for VRETH oversight integration. The bolt patterns were different here. Corridor seams had a different quality, tighter tolerances, older alloys. The work of engineers who'd been building for humans in an era when that was the only relevant consideration. Morrow had been through this corridor once before in the other direction, running a recovery that he hadn't questioned. He knew the layout, pulled Albie into a maintenance alcove off the main passage. "There's a cargo runner at docking arm 7, he said. "Teshin Hall. Crew chief is a woman named Auric. She runs legitimate freight, and she doesn't like compliance inspections. She's not political." He paused. "She's paid. I have discretionary acquisition funds." Albie considered this. "You're going to bribe a freight operator to get me to Cressida. I'm going to compensate a licensed cargo operator for expedited transport of classified materials under evidence chain custody." He met Albie's eyes. "If Auric asks questions, let me handle them. If something goes wrong, if we separate, if the corridor closes, if you need to move without me, go toward the nearest cluster of human workers and make noise. Not a word, noise. Loud, sustained, irregular. VRETH automated systems have a processing delay of approximately 8 seconds when resolving acoustic inputs in the human panic frequency range. They're designed for a lot of things. That specific scenario they were not designed for." Albie looked at him with a quality of attention that Morrow had not expected. "You know their systems very well." "I've worked inside them for 6 years, Morrow said. "I paid attention. I just paid it toward the wrong end." Was in the maintenance bay off Arm 7, arguing with a loading system that kept rejecting her weight distribution manifests. She was a compact woman with short gray hair and the particular quality of focus that comes from running freight operations for 20 years. Everything evaluated for cost, risk, and time, in that order, with sentiment a distant fourth if it placed at all. She looked up when Morrow came in, saw the compliance designation on his coat, and her expression settled into the flat preparedness of someone who had been difficult with Concorde. Inspectors before and had found it satisfying. Morrow told her what he needed. He didn't explain why. Put the number in the table. Credit transfers, clean, from the discretionary acquisition fund. that the Concord Compliance Division maintained for evidence purchase situations, and watched her read it. "You want me to run to Cressida on a delayed manifest," she said, "without Dominion traffic clearance. Delayed manifests are within operational parameters. A 6-hour window is standard for independent freight operators with a Class C licensing agreement. It's within the letter of them," she said. "That's what letters are for." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Albie, who was standing in the bay doorway with his bag and his stillness, and the expression of a man who had already survived several versions of this conversation and was prepared to survive one more. She looked back at Morrow. 6-hour manifest delay. You file your own boarding record under evidence custody. What you're carrying is none of my business, and I don't want it to be. She confirmed the transfer without looking away from him. You're out of my hold before I dock at Cressida. I never met you, and I wouldn't know you from any of the 50 compliance officers who've made my life difficult over the past 8 years, Morrow confirmed. She was already turning back to her loading system. The Teshian Hall was a mid-class freighter, functional and unloved in the way of working vessels, every surface optimized for utility, and cleaned when it needed to be cleaned, and not before. The hold where Morrow and Albie settled was accessed through a service corridor that Auric didn't walk them through and didn't need to. It was full of cargo containers sealed with standard locks, and a faint ambient smell of recycled atmosphere and machine oil that Morrow found, in the specific way of things associated with professional solitude, almost comforting. They had 4 hours and 20 minutes to Cressida Station at the hall's transit speed. Alb fell asleep 40 minutes in. He sat with his back against a cargo container and his bag on his lap and went to sleep, with the economy of someone who has learned to take rest in intervals, the way soldiers and researchers and anyone else whose work doesn't respect human scheduling learns to do. He slept without any of the small adjustments and resettlings of someone fighting sleep. Just went still and was asleep. He sat across from him in the hold's work lighting and turned the drive over in his hands. He thought about the 6 years in a way he hadn't before, not defensively, not searching for justifications, not constructing the argument for why he hadn't known, why he couldn't have been expected to know. Just looking at it. Professional discipline of not examining what he collected had been, he understood now, a structural feature of the compliance division, rather than an accidental one. The Concord had built a human enforcement mechanism that was specifically calibrated to produce capable, reliable operatives who operated within authorization structures that prevented them from accumulating the context that would make them ask questions. Morrow had been good at his job because he'd internalized the structure completely. He hadn't examined what he carried because examination was inefficiency. He hadn't asked what the classification basis was because that was above his clearance level. He had been an excellent instrument, and the thing that made him excellent was the same thing that made him useful to the suppression of a technology that could change the material conditions of human existence across every colony and outpost and settled system in the sector. He thought about Callis, a soil analyst, not a political operative. Someone who'd found something in the data he was supposed to be processing and hadn't been able to not report it, chosen a method of reporting that the compliance apparatus had been waiting to intercept, who was, right now, somewhere in Dominion custody, and whose family had petitioned for contact rights 8 times. He thought about the 3 colleagues whose names Albie had not told him yet. He looked at the drive. Then he looked at Albie, across the hold, and thought about what it cost to carry something for 11 years. Patient accumulation of data, the careful secrecy, the watching of colleagues disappear, the arrival on a platform to sit in a charging bay and wait for the person who had been sent to stop you, because the only move left was to hand him the thing and let him decide who he was. Albie woke when they were 40 minutes out from Cressida. He opened his eyes and oriented immediately, checked his bag, found Morrow watching him. "You haven't decided whether to regret this," Albie said. "Decided not to," Morrow said. "The regret is for what came before." Albie was quiet for a moment outside the hull, transit field, hummed at the frequency of a vessel at near cruise. "What made you come back?" Albie said. "At the gate. Morrow thought about how to answer that, honestly. He had a version that was clean. Something about justice, about the soil inhibitors, about the accumulated weight of 6 years of compliance. It was all true, it wasn't the whole thing. I counted to 11, he said. Don't know why, 11 specifically. Some things have a length you feel when it's finished. He looked at the drive. The 3 colleagues. What were their names? Albie told him. He said them slowly and without ceremony, in the manner of someone who has learned to say names as if they are objects with weight. Because they are. Because names are the last persistent form of a person in the world, and you owe them the gravity of that. Morrow filed them. Not a metaphor. He actually stored them in the part of his mind where he kept the things he used to navigate. Reference points, coordinates, the specific weights that told him where he was and which way was forward. Preseda Station was listed in the Concord Administrative Register as a civilian science relay hub. Low security classification, Joint Human Breath Administration lightly staffed. In practice, it was run by a rotating crew of human technicians who'd been stationed there long. Enough that the Breath oversight staff treated them as fixtures of the infrastructure, rather than persons requiring monitoring. It was the kind of facility that the Dominion considered too small to allocate serious attention to. Albie had known this when he'd chosen it, 11 years ago, as the endpoint. They came in on the hull's delayed manifest, docked without incident, and Morrow and Albie were out of the hold before the docking seal pressurized, moving through the station's maintenance access using Morrow's compliance credentials. 2 more checkpoints, 1 human-staffed, 1 automated, and a moment in a secondary corridor where a breath monitoring drone passed close enough overhead that Morrow stepped slightly in front of Albie and adjusted his pace to read as a single person, moving with deliberate non-urgency, because the drone's tracking algorithm resolved identity primarily from gait profile, and he'd been trained to know that. The broadcast room was at the station's science level. The door was unlocked, which meant Albie's contact was expecting them. The contact was a young technician named Pell, mid-20s, bright and visibly frightened, the specific bodies of a language of someone who has made a decision they still believe in and is not entirely sure what believing in it costs. When Morrow came through the door behind Albie, Pell's hand moved toward the console with the reflex of someone considering whether to shut everything down and run. He's with me, Albie said. He was the operative they sent. He's not running the mission anymore. Pell looked at Morrow, not with hostility, with the very careful attention of someone deciding whether they can afford to trust a thing. Morrow stood still and let himself be assessed. He didn't try to help the assessment along. If Pell needed to look at him and decide for himself, then that was what needed to happen. Okay, Pell said. He turned back to the console. I've had the system ready for 3 days. Full relay broadcast. Simultaneous dispatch to all 43 stations on the civilian science network. The encryption uses the public standard Concord research key, which means anyone with a standard receiver can decrypt it. Pulled up the transmission schematic. I need about 20 minutes to run the pre-transmission verification. We have less than that, Morrow said. How much less I can't guarantee. Voth will have flagged my deviation by now. The Vreth response protocol for a station of this classification is typically 17 to 25 minutes from flag to physical presence. We may be at the close edge of that window. He looked at the room, 1 door, 1 window onto the main corridor, console configuration he'd need to work with. Run the verification, I'll manage the time. He went to the door and locked it using his compliance codes, using a security sequence from the Concord operations manual that he'd never had reason to use before. Then he moved to the window and read the corridor. And he thought about what he was doing, standing at a window in a science relay station with his compliance codes, holding a door that the Vreth could override. He was standing between a thing and what was coming for it. This was structurally what he'd done for 6 years. The difference was the thing. 7 minutes into Pell's verification sequence, the Vreth response team arrived. 4 of them. Not combat units, Dominion compliance operatives, the equivalent of Morrow's role translated through Vreth operational design. Long-limbed, matte gray operational suits, moving in the synchronized manner of a unit whose members had trained together long enough to move as a system rather than as individuals. Their team lead, identified by the additional frequency band in its suit's communication array, approached the broadcast room door and entered a standard override sequence. The door didn't open. Morrow had recoded the lock to a human standard sequence from the pre-Concorde station, Kekcher spec, a legacy format that predated the Vreth integration requirements, and that the Dominion override library didn't carry because it predated the Concorde entirely. He'd known it was in the station's architecture because he'd done a facility assessment here 18 months ago for a different mission and had noted it the way he noted all structural details, without knowing at the time why he was filing it. He had 4 minutes, approximately, while they ran a secondary override protocol. Status, he said to Pell. 62%, Pell said. Replication proof files are the bottleneck. They're the largest component of the packet. The Vreth team lead was communicating with its unit, a layered frequency exchange that no human translation device could resolve in real time, but Morrow had spent years learning to read through posture and positioning. He read, methodical, deliberate, no urgency. They believed they had time. They believed the door would yield to process. He thought about what the Vreth consistently got wrong. Not the specifics. They were not wrong about the specifics. They had excellent intelligence. They had accurate models of human organizational behavior, human institutional responses, human regulatory structures. What they miscalculated was beneath the institutional level, in the material that institutions were built from. Humans, individually, were not more courageous than other species. They were afraid of most things in proportion to the danger, the way all successful species are afraid of things, because species that aren't afraid of things tend to stop being species. Courage was not the differentiator. What was different, what the Vreth models consistently failed to weight correctly, was stubbornness, the specific quality of human persistence past the point where the cost-benefit analysis said to stop. The way a human, once committed to a thing, continue not because they'd found a reason the calculus didn't account for, because they had decided, and the decision was made, and they were going to see what was on the other side of it. The way the mind keeps generating approaches while the body holds the position. The way terror and determination occupy the same person simultaneously without canceling each other out. Morrow went to the console beside Pell and began working the station's internal systems, not to stop the Vreth override, which he could not stop indefinitely, but to sequence the station's interior security infrastructure on a cascade delay. Not to block the team, slow them. Each internal barrier requiring a new override code, each code costing time, the barriers positioned at intervals in the corridor between the door and the broadcast console. He built a corridor of seconds. It was what he had to offer. He offered it. How long do you need, he said. Pell stared at the progress bar. 5 minutes, maybe 6. I'm giving you 6, Morrow said. The outer door held for 90 seconds before the Vreth team's secondary override resolved. The first interior barrier, positioned in the corridor junction, cost them 41 seconds. The second, at the science-level access point, cost them 33. The third, which Morrow had positioned at the broadcast room's inner threshold, and which he'd layered by chaining two separate override requirements in sequence, technique from the Concorde Security Operational Guide that had existed for other purposes entirely, cost them 72 seconds. He stood at the final barrier and listened to the Vreth team working through it from the other side. Looked back at Pell and the progress bar, and Albie, who was sitting in the corner of the room with his bag on his lap, watching the readout with the absolute stillness of a person at the end of a very long journey. 91%, 94. He thought of the names. He said them inside himself, not out loud. The 3 colleagues, the names Albie had given him in the hold. He had found, over years, that this was what holding a position actually required. Not willpower, which was an abstraction. Weight. Something specific and concrete to carry, which kept the body grounded. And the mind from going sideways into calculation. About things that weren't, yet decided. 97. The door opened. The Vreth team lead came through first. It had 4 optical receptors and all of them swept the room in a single coordinated pass. The door, the window, Pell at the console, Albie in the corner, Morrow standing at the inner threshold with his hands at his sides, and his face showing nothing in particular. 100%, Pell said. It's out, all 43 stations. The room went very quiet. The Vreth team lead's optical array fixed on the console readout for a long moment. It was reading the transmission confirmation. It was understanding what that confirmation meant. Morrow watched it understand, not from expression, because Vreth facial anatomy didn't map to the legibility humans were adapted to read, but from the stillness, particular quality of a being processing information that has changed the parameters of the situation it was sent to resolve. Morrow said, "You have your orders and you're going to follow them. I'm not disputing that. But there are 43 independent research stations in the relay network, and every one of them received the full research packet 12 seconds ago with a public standard decryption key and verified replication proofs. The packet is mirrored across the receiving systems by the standard relay protocol. You can take everyone in this room. The science is already out. What happens in this room now doesn't change that." The team lead's dual-frequency voice rendered in translation as, "You are in violation of Dominion Classification Protocol 7-9 and Concord Compliance Directive 14. You are required to submit to custody." "Yes," Morrow said. "I know." He put his hands where they could be seen. He did it without being told, because being told to do it and doing it before being told to are different things, and the difference mattered to him in a way he couldn't have explained in fully, but didn't need to. He was arrested in the specific manner of someone who has already decided to be arrested, which is a very different experience from being taken by surprise. He had thought about this in the hold, in the dark, while Albie slept across from him, and the drive turned over in his hands. The next phase was going to be long and difficult, and without any of the resolution that the structure of this kind of story usually provided. There would be Concord proceedings. There would be Dominion diplomatic pressure. There would be the specific sustained exposure of having refused to function as the system had designed him to function, and systems that have been refused in this way tend to work methodically to discredit the refusal. He had 6 years of specifics. He knew the authorization chains. He knew the classification records and the decision points, and the names of the Concord officials who had signed off on suppression orders. He knew these things because he had been the instrument of their implementation. That knowledge was now his testimony. He was thinking about this when the station's open communication band came alive. It started with the automated acknowledgement signals. The relay network's standard receipt confirmations, dry and technical, 30 characters confirming packet receipt and checksum validation. Then those stopped and something else started. Station after station, as the research packet finished decrypting through the public standard key, and the researchers, working the receivers, read the abstract and opened the methodology files and began to understand what 11 years of data looked like when it was presented completely and in replicable form, not automated, human voices. Some clipped and professional in the manner of people who'd spent their careers on remote science stations learning not to sound excited about things. Some not clipping it at all. One said, "Can someone verify this key is standard issue? This can't be what I think it is." Another said, "I'm running the verification now, hold." A pause, then, "It verifies this is real." A longer pause. Then a third voice, young, the slight breathless. "We can build this. This is buildable right now. We have everything we need at this station to begin replication." Morrow sat on the floor of the broadcast room with his hands restrained behind him, and his back against the console and the relay band coming through the station's open communication system. He listened to the voices accumulate. Someone was asking about the material requirements for the capture array. Someone was already doing the calculation on the existing infrastructure at their station, running it against the methodology, coming back with a number that made them repeat the calculation twice. Someone was calling a name, one of their colleagues, telling them to come look at something. He listened to this and felt something that took him a moment to identify, because it had been some time since he'd had occasion to feel it. The specific weight of having been on the right side of something, not triumph, not relief, something lower and more structural. The way a load-bearing element feels when the thing it was built to support is actually there. Correct. Useful for what it was meant to be useful for. Albie was sitting beside him. He had put his bag down finally, first time since Morrow had found him on the platform. It sat on the floor of the broadcast room. Unremarkable, like something that had served its purpose. Albie was looking at the ceiling, and his face had changed. The stillness was still there, but the quality of it had shifted. It was no longer the stillness of someone carrying a weight through difficult ground. It was the stillness of someone who has set the weight down. 11 years, Morrow said. 11 years, Albie said. The Reach colonies. Will the energy research be enough to do something about the inhibitors? Albie thought about it. Not quickly, the way he thought about everything, which was carefully and without rushing the consideration to get to the comfortable answer. Not directly, but the calculus shifts. If the colonies can generate their own power, their supply chain dependency on the Dominion changes. The leverage the inhibitors are designed to create becomes a smaller instrument. It still works, but its range contracts. And when the inhibitors become public, which they will, because now the energy research is out, and people will start looking at related suppression actions, the political cost of the strategy becomes much higher, he paused. It won't be quick. No, Morrow said, but it'll be real. That's the thing that matters. Not the speed, the solidity. The corridor outside had more footsteps now. The machinery of consequence assembling itself. Morrow led it. He had 11 seconds after walking away from Albie at a transit hub gate turned around. He had done this not because he was certain of the outcome. He was not certain of the outcome and would not be for a long time, but because 11 seconds was enough time to look at the full weight of what he'd been carrying and understand that he couldn't put it down in the direction he'd been walking. He was going to testify. He had already decided this in the hold with the drive in his hands. He was going to give the Concord proceedings everything he had, the authorization chains, the classification orders, the compliance file records, the names. He was going to be the kind of problem that is very difficult to address quietly because it consists entirely of documented facts, presented by a witness with 6 years of direct operational experience. He had been a very good asset. He was going to be a better problem. They led him out of the broadcast room and down the corridor, and he walked steadily, not resisting and not assisting, maintaining the neutral competence of someone who has made a decision and will not be performing distress about it for anyone's benefit. The relay band had gone quieter on the station speakers. Either the volume had been lowered in the commotion, or the initial burst of voices had moved to internal channels, but he knew it was still going. He knew that 43 stations had received the packet, and that the public standard key was propagating through the civilian network. Every time one of those stations' systems automatically mirrored their received data per the relay protocol. He knew the research was out in a way that could not be unreleased. Not because of the broadcast. One broadcast could be disputed. Records could be challenged. But because 20 minutes after a replication-proof methodology reaches 43 independent research stations, it begins being replicated. That was what replication proofs were for. That was what Albie had spent 11 years building toward. A packet so complete and so verifiable that the first person who received it and had the necessary equipment could begin building the capture array without further instruction. The third voice on the relay band had already said it. We can build this right now. Morrow walked down the corridor and thought about the star outside the station's hull. A medium-class star, the same type that Albie's research had been calibrated to, radiating exactly what the methodology described. Offering, as it had been offering since before there were humans to observe it, something enormous and inexhaustible and entirely available to anyone who had the instructions for receiving it. The instructions were out. Whatever came next, the proceedings, the Dominion pressure, the long and difficult work of making the testimony count for something. That was already happened. The research was already in 43 places. It was already being read. It was already in at least one station being built. He had stood at a gate and counted to 11. He had turned around. The rest was already real. Outside, the star kept burning, the same as it had always burned, patient and vast, and indifferent to whether anyone was listening. Someone was listening now. The Concord proceedings began 14 days after the Cressida incident. Morrow was held in a human-administered facility on Meridian Platform, a deliberate choice by the Concord's joint administration, because holding him in a Vreth facility would have generated the kind of documentation that tends to circulate in ways that the Dominion liaison staff did not want circulating. The room was standard issue: desk, chair, a window with a view of the docking arm infrastructure. He slept well. He had expected not to, and then he did. And he thought this said something about the relationship between certainty and rest. Not certainty about outcomes, which he didn't have, but certainty about what you'd done and why, which he did. Voth visited on the third day. She came alone, without a documentation team, which was itself a signal. She sat across the desk from him and looked at him with 3 of her 4 optical receptors, time before she said anything. "You understand," she said, "that what you've done is not reversible." "I know," Morrow said. "The research is propagating through the relay network. We estimate it has now reached approximately 230 individual researchers and research teams across the sector. The replication threshold was crossed within 18 hours. Our monitors flagged 4 stations that had begun construction of capture array components before the end of the first day." She paused. "This cannot be suppressed." "I know," Morrow said again. "Then explain to me," she said, and her doubled voice was careful in a way he hadn't heard from her before. Not hostile, not demanding, with the careful quality of something that is genuinely trying to understand a thing it didn't predict. "What you believed you were achieving." Morrow thought about how to answer honestly. "The Reach soil inhibitors," he said. "The 3 researchers at Helix Array. Callus. It's been in Dominion custody for 2 years for a soil analysis." He looked at her directly. "I have spent 6 years executing missions on the understanding that I was maintaining a negotiated agreement between 2 species. That's what the Concord told me I was doing. That's what I told myself I was doing." He paused. "I was maintaining a dependency structure, one that requires human settlements to remain insufficient to their own needs, so that the supply chains that generate Dominion leverage remain operative." Voth was still. "The energy research changes that," he said. "Not instantly, not cleanly, but it changes the material foundation of the relationship. And that's what you were suppressing. Not a security risk, not a genuine dual-use technology with weapons applications. You were suppressing something that would have made us harder to manage." He held her gaze. "I understand why the Dominion did it. I understand the strategic logic, that I wasn't willing to continue being the instrument of it." The silence lasted a long time. Then Voth said something he hadn't expected. She said, "We did not anticipate that the Compliance Division would produce an operative who would read what he was carrying." It was not an apology, he didn't want one, but it was something more honest than anything she'd said to him in 6 years of briefings, and he recognized it as such. "That's the problem with designing a system around people who don't ask questions," Morrow said. "Eventually you get one who starts." She left without another word. He didn't see her again. Proceedings themselves were long and technical, and lacking in any of the drama that the word suggests. Morrow gave his testimony in 12 sessions over 3 weeks, working through 6 years of compliance operations in chronological order, deducing from memory the authorization chains and classification orders and mission parameters that he had, as a professional habit, committed to accurate recall, because in covert operations, the ability to produce a precise accounting of events was operationally valuable. He had not expected to produce this accounting in the service of the people whose interests he'd been suppressing. He had kept the habit anyway. Habits that are built for good reasons tend to survive the collapse of the specific context that generated them, and sometimes they turn out to be useful for a reason you couldn't have predicted. The Concord's human legal staff told him, at the end of the 2nd week, that Callus had been transferred to human-administered custody and was expected to be released pending the review of the classification basis for his original detention. He received this information and sat with it for a moment and then moved on to the next session. He received through an encrypted relay message that he could not trace, but that he suspected originated from Cressida Station, brief communication that read, 4 more stations confirmed operational replication. Each colony network has requested the full research packet via the civilian relay. The number is growing. No signature. He filed the message in his memory under the category of things that kept his feet on the floor. The proceedings produced, after 6 weeks, a formal Concord review of Dominion Classification Authority over human research, conducted using joint facility instrumentation. The review was not a victory. It was a process, slow and procedural, and requiring ongoing participation from people on both sides who had competing interests in its outcome. Morrow was asked to remain available as a continuing witness. He agreed to this. He was not offered his position back in the compliance division. He didn't expect to be and had not wanted it. He was offered a route he hadn't anticipated, a position as an independent compliance observer, a role that had existed in the Concord Treaty language as a theoretical oversight mechanism and had never been activated because it was not in either party's institutional interest to activate it. Now there was a reason to activate it, and a person who understood the compliance system from the inside and had demonstrably refused to remain embedded in it. He took the position. It was not a clean resolution. He was not under the impression that it was a clean resolution. The soil inhibitor program in the Reach was under investigation, but investigations moved at the pace of processes, involving entrenched institutional interests and careful jurisdictional negotiations, which was to say slowly. The energy research was propagating through the scientific community, and the first working prototypes were appearing on independent stations. There was a difference between a prototype in a research environment and a deployed energy infrastructure, and the gap between those two things was filled with engineering challenges and supply chain questions, and the kind of political friction that attended any change to the material conditions that powerful systems were built around. He was, in some sense, the beginning of a different kind of work. The kind that didn't end in a completion report. He found he didn't mind this. He was on Meridian platform when the first public demonstration of a working capture array was broadcast on the Civilian Science Network. He watched it on a screen in a transit hub concourse. A small gathering of people had formed around the display, human, and 1 or 2 of the VRETH civilian administrators who worked the platform, everyone watching a research station technician in a gray jumpsuit stand next to a piece of equipment the size of a refrigerator and explain the specific excitement of someone who has been up for 30 hours doing something that worked. What the power output readings meant. Morrow stood in the back of the crowd and watched the technician's face and the readout numbers, and the people around him responding to both. He thought about 11 seconds at a gate. He thought about what it was that determined whether a person finished the walk or turned around. He had spent some time trying to articulate this and had found that it didn't articulate cleanly, which might be the point. That the thing that made the difference was specifically resistant to the kind of systematic analysis that would make it possible to manufacture in advance. You could not pre-decide to turn around at the right moment. You could only pay attention for long enough to the weight of what you were carrying. And then the moment came, and it was the length it was, and either you finished it or you didn't. He had counted to 11. He did not know why 11. He thought about the 3 names. He said them to himself in the middle of the crowd, looking at a screen showing a piece of equipment that Soren Albee had spent 11 years building toward. He thought about the specific weight of names used as orientation points, as ballast, as the concrete specific thing that keeps the abstract from becoming untethered from what it's actually about. A woman beside him in the crowd said, to no one in particular, "They're saying 6 months to first deployment on a colony station." No one answered. Everyone was watching the screen. Morrow watched it too for a while. Then he left the crowd and walked toward the South Concourse, where he had a meeting with a Concord review officer about the next phase of the inhibitor investigation. The work was there. He was going to do it. The star outside was burning the same as it had always burned, and more people than yesterday knew how to receive what it was offering, and the number would keep growing. And some things once released cannot be contained, not because they are too large, but because they are too right. Because the moment someone sees that a thing is possible, and the instructions for making it real, are in their hands. They begin making it real, and that is a process that does not require permission to continue. He walked through the transit hub, past the charging station, where a man with pale eyes and calloused hands had once eaten a protein bar and waited, person who had been sent to stop him. He walked steadily, as he always did. He had things to do.